look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spend. Take another look now and take some time for hemp. I don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, right now it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking Time for Hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leitch. You are listening to Time for Hemp on Tumblr, SoundCloud, iTunes, and, of course, iHeartRadio. We are the only 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, all cannabis broadcasting network on iHeartRadio. And like a good joint, we are best when you share us with your friends. Make it a point to let everybody know that we have a team of people here that is working diligently to end prohibition all around the world. You can find new content from Judge James Gray to Al Graham, who's in Canada, to people from all points on the planet. So, again, do make us a point and share us with your friends. Big thank you to KDK Distributors for giving us a grant to keep us loud, proud, and strong. Today on the program, we are going to be focusing on normal activities and a normal way to approach ending prohibition. It's been way too long since I've had my friend Keith Stroup on the program. Those of you who've been listening realize I've been busy building a network, and I have just overlooked some of the wonderful people in my life coming onto the program. And Keith, let me say it has. It's been way too long since we've had you
Well, it's not nice to be back with you, Casper, and I'm delighted that you've got your network up and running.
And I certainly want to let you know our audience do love hearing your input and the things that you have to share. You get around so much within the marijuana movement, not just on a national level, but on an international level as well. A lot of things happening on the UN treaties and a lot of things happening in other countries that are making an impact here on America. It would be smart of me to hush up and let someone who is as informed as you to share with our audience what's going on internationally.
Well, first off, people need to understand that there are essentially two primary international treaties that have some potential impact on what we do domestically regarding drug policy. The primary one is called the Single Convention Treaty of 1961, and the other is the Psychotropic Drug Convention. Now, our opponents would like to argue, and they do, Kevin Sabat at Project Smart and others, like to argue that we can't legalize marijuana in America because it's we're bound by the provisions of the Single Convention and the Drug and Psychotropic Convention. Well, the reality is the terms of those treaties permit any of the parties to disavow or disassociate from any specific provisions, and all they have to do is to have the desire to do so. They notify the governing body. I think it's a 6-month waiting period, and at the end of that 6 months, without requiring any approval by anyone, the party is no longer bound by those provisions. So, for example, we could still maintain our strong anti-drug policy internationally regarding more dangerous drugs, international cocaine smuggling or whatever, but we could simply advise the governing body of the Single Convention that we no longer wish to be bound by the marijuana provisions, and 6 months later we would not be bound. Now, the reality is it will take some time before any American administration has the commitment strong enough to do that, because you can imagine right now there would be an outcry from the conservatives in Congress. But nonetheless, raising the international treaties as some excuse for why we cannot adopt legalization in the United States is simply not accurate. That does not stand in our way. And frankly, here's the other point. There is no international police force. In other words, even if you were in violation of the treaty, and certainly some would argue that allowing Colorado and Washington and Oregon and Alaska to go ahead and legalize marijuana very well may put us in violation, technically, of some of the provisions of the single convention. But so what? There's nobody at your door to arrest you from the international police force because there is no such police force. So these are kind of interesting documents for people involved in the Department of State and those kinds of things to deal with, but they don't have much impact on our individual lives in this country. And the other thing to know is the reason those treaties exist largely is because the United States browbeat a lot of countries into signing them. When those treaties were first being considered, a lot of countries had reservations. They weren't sure they wanted to be part of that. They wanted to be able to make their own decisions. But of course, what happened is the United States had such enormous economic power that we simply bludgeoned them into doing what we wanted. That's particularly fascinating since, as you know, over the last decade, on at least 2 occasions, the Jamaican Parliament has come very close to legalizing marijuana. I've been down there twice to testify, as have Ethan Nadelman from DPA and some others from the states. And on each of those occasions, it was clear the local politicians very much wanted to legalize marijuana in Jamaica. But every time they announced their intention, the U.S. used our economic powers once again to threaten them, and so they backed off. However, now that the U.S. is allowing individual states in this country to legalize marijuana, you notice that Jamaica is finally moving forward, as are a number of other countries, in our hemisphere. So whatever fear one has about our international treaties, I assure you they are not going to stand in the way of the U.S. legalizing marijuana.
Well, and I have also noticed that through my involvement in the marijuana and industrial hemp movement that, with Canada producing hemp products and China importing them in, and down in Australia we got the hempcrete and so on, that these products are being made in various countries, as well as studies are being done on cannabis for medical value, like GW Pharmaceuticals did a study over in England for a handful of years. So outside the country, those events are happening. Now, you would think that our country would look at our neighboring countries and start leading the way instead of dragging their feet.
Well, interestingly, I think to a great degree, the United States is leading the way right now, but it's not the federal government. It's the various state governments. The role the federal government has played that's been terribly important, of course, is that Obama elected to stand back and allow the states to experiment with different versions of legalization without federal interference. That was an extraordinarily important decision by Obama. Under numerous presidents in the past, certainly the Bushes and others, probably even under Clinton, I think what they would have done, the Department of Justice would have gone into federal court and sought an injunction claiming that the part of those state laws that licenses growers and sellers is in direct conflict with federal prohibition, and under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, most likely they would have been granted an injunction, and those provisions would have been shut down. Now, what you would have been left with is interesting. There is no obligation on the part of a state to mimic the federal drug law. So a state is free to remove all of its drug laws if they want. And when these states have adopted legalization, what they've done is they've removed penalties for possession of up to a certain amount and for growing up to a certain amount. And then they go further, and in order to regulate the market, they license growers and sellers. Well, if the federal government were successful in joining the provisions dealing with licensing growers and sellers, what they would be left with is a state in which there were simply no laws against marijuana possession or growing, at least small quantities, and it would be far less regulation than what the current system has. So I think Obama understood that. I think the Department of Justice understood it, and they made a calculated decision that they would rather see a system with regulation and control than they would see a system where there were just no laws at all other than a federal law. And frankly, you don't have anywhere near enough federal police to come in and enforce marijuana laws at the state level.
No, they do need the help of the local authorities to make the arrest and prosecutions occur. That's true. Now, speaking on a national level, it is a little odd. I keep hearing that there are medical raids going on in the medical states being conducted by the DEA. Perhaps I am wrong when I hear that. And people say that Obama could, with a stroke of a pen, change the scheduling and could even end it with one of his many edicts that he puts out with everything else. There's a lot of things that could be done. What do you think?
First off, the only federal busts that I'm aware of, and again, I'm not close enough to the scene to be certain of the facts behind them, but it appears that the feds are only getting involved. And if you remember the Cole memo, there were two different Cole memos that were issued. Cole was a deputy attorney general under Holder. They issued a couple of memoranda in which they suggested to the U.S. attorneys that if these various state legalization laws, whether they were medical use legalization or full legalization, if they met certain criteria, and there were 4 or 5 or 6 of them, that the feds would stay out of it. But one of those criteria was the people involved must be operating within the parameters of the state law. Well, what happens is sometimes you have somebody who's in a state where marijuana is legal, but they may be selling marijuana out the back door as well as operating a dispensary or a grow operation. And if the feds stumble across that somehow, I certainly have no reason to think they're not going to step in and enforce federal law. And again, the criteria they talked about were trying to minimize marijuana getting in the hands of adolescents, trying to minimize the flow of marijuana from a legal state to a state where it remains illegal, and, common sense things like that. And I don't have any problem with those. I think the states should be free to make their own marijuana policies, and certainly they should not be exporting marijuana to the states where it has not yet been legalized. But again, I may be wrong. There may be instances of where the feds have stepped in when they shouldn't have, but at least as to my knowledge, the cases where the feds occasionally go in, like in California, and recently there was one case in Colorado as well, but the allegation was that these folks in Colorado, in addition to holding some dispensary licenses, they were caught with, I forget now, but 150 pounds or something of marijuana in a neighboring state making a delivery. Well, that's clearly against Colorado law as well as federal law. So, again, I'm not a big supporter of the federal government generally, and I know a lot of people were disappointed in Obama during his first term because they knew, he was a member of the Stroup gang when he was in high school, and also continued to smoke when he was in college for a while as well, according to his own book, as well as books that have been written about him. So there were some people who felt when he came in that maybe one of the first things he would do would be to legalize marijuana. I think that was just unrealistic. There are lots of priorities a U.S. president has, and dealing with drug policy is certainly not at the top of the stack. And it also remains a fairly controversial issue. We have the support of a majority of the American public now, but it's between 53 and 58%. So that means that there's still, somewhere between 42 and 47% of the country that are opposed to that. So it didn't surprise me that the president did very little during his first term to move or advance the legalization agenda. But his second term, I think he has really given us the biggest favor he could ever have done, and that's by simply standing aside, telling the Department of Justice to focus on more serious matters and let these states see if they could implement those legalization laws in a manner that was good for everyone, and to demonstrate that there would be no significant unintended consequences. And I think Colorado and Washington are both in the process of doing that right now, and I'm very confident the results we've seen so far are very reinforcing of regulation rather than prohibition. And I think the same thing will be true in Oregon and Alaska once they have their systems up and running. So I'm actually a big fan of what Obama has done in the area of marijuana policy.
Well, and as you speak, Ken Burns' documentary on prohibition kept coming to my mind, where there were some counties that were dry, some counties you could have it, some counties were importing it and exporting it when they shouldn't, and all that going on. And it's almost verbatim, tit for tat, the exact same thing, isn't it?
It is indeed, by the way. I think that's another good point you made, Casper. Some folks think the goal should be to have the federal government simply legalize marijuana. I don't think so at all. I think it's far better to do what we did at the end of alcohol prohibition. And what they did was they simply backed the federal government out of the area and said to the states, you're free to do what you want. If you want to continue to arrest your own citizens for drinking alcohol, you can do that. If you want to experiment with different versions of legalizing and regulating alcohol, you can do that. And what we're seeing right now indicates that none of these first few laws are going to be a perfect marijuana legalization model, and it's because it's new territory. We're learning. In Colorado, for example, I think folks were not anticipating the incredible demand for edibles. We were assuming people would be smoking marijuana. Well, in fact, there's a big market for edibles, and there was a problem initially. People were selling edibles that looked like a brownie, but in fact they were intended to have 10 doses. In other words, the state of Colorado, the commission that controls things there, had come up with a formula saying that I think 10 milligrams of THC should be a single-dose unit for an individual in an edible. And I think that's probably about right. But it's unrealistic to think that you're going to have a regular-sized brownie, which we're all accustomed and have eaten, over the years at different times, that somehow we're going to divide that up into 10 parts and spread it around. Come on. So people were overdosing in a sense. They were eating so much that when it finally kicked in, they were having an unpleasant experience. And there were a few examples of the edibles were packaged, I think they were simply trying to be cute. I don't think they were trying to harm children, but they were packaged in such a way as to look very much like traditional candy. And obviously there were a few examples of young children thinking they were candy and having a bad experience. Now, I want to say real quickly, understand, when you overdose with alcohol, it affects your brainstem. And if you drink about 10 times the amount of alcohol it takes to get drunk, you will die from your failure to breathe. You suffocate. With marijuana, fortunately, you cannot die from an overdose. It does not affect the brainstem, and it doesn't affect your breathing. But let's be honest here. If you take a significant amount of THC in an edible, you can indeed have a very bad experience, and some people turn themselves into the emergency room because they think they're going crazy or they're about to die or whatever. Fortunately, no one's ever died in the history of mankind from marijuana, so you're not going to die. But what we do want to do is make sure that we roll out these legalization laws in a manner to reinforce the fact that we're not trying to frighten non-smokers. We want a policy that's going to work for everybody. Only 14% of the general population are regular marijuana smokers. 86% are not. So you can see that for us to continue to win these battles, we have to maintain the support of a majority of the non-smokers. And we have that now, but we know we must be careful in the way we roll out these new laws so that we don't unnecessarily frighten the non-smokers and lose that political support.
Well, one thing that we cannot lose here on the big broadcast is the support of our sponsors. With that said, we're going to take a commercial break, pay our bills, listen to a groovy tune about how awesome marijuana is by the group called Echo Movement. I love their work. And then we're going to come back and pick up where we left off here at Time for Hemp. You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. Please share us with your friends.
THCF Medical Clinics are the premier physicians clinic in the United States. THCF has offices all across the United States from Hawaii to Michigan. THCF Medical Clinics has helped approximately 150,000 patients obtain their medical marijuana permits to legally possess, grow, and use medical marijuana. If you have chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, or any other neurological degenerative disease, or if you have any gastrointestinal disorders such as GERD, irritable bowel syndrome, or if you have AIDS, cancer, spastic disorders, seizure disorders, or glaucoma, call us at 1-800-723-0188 or visit us online at hemp.org. Again, the number is 1-800-723-0188 and the site is hemp.org. Ganja.
Some may say, why they take my choice? My way of life is my freedom's voice. If the government cared about your health, cigarettes and liquor be off the shelf. Propaganda feeds the hungry beast. The government is best, which governs least. We said, some we say, ganja. We say, ganja. Some may say, why they take my choice? Back in the day, the people had no voice. 1937, the FBN, Harry and Slinger and some shady men. A lot of Congress saying marijuana kills, 'cause hemp fathers went to the paper mills. We said, some we say, ganja. We say, ganja.
That's the Echo Movement, and you were listening to a tune called True Ganja here on Time for Hemp. Please make it a point to share us with your friends. That's how we get the message out. We have large archive where all of our programming can be downloaded and shared with your friends. Our MP3s are actually small enough that you can put them in an email and send them to not just friends and family, but to members of Congress, members of the Senate, and politicians in your area who need to know how important it is to take time for hemp. On the program today, I'm having a joint conversation with a joint friend of mine. It's been way too long. It's good to hear your voice. Seriously, we've been at this. Keith, 25 years I've been talking to you off and on these podcasts and shows and interviews. Good golly, Miss Molly. And now we've got a new leader of the Justice Department who is in direct disagreement with our president. She said, unless I'm mistaken, that she wants to see all medical marijuana ended and marijuana use and users locked up. What's up with that?
I'll be honest with you, Casper. I thought that was the position of the former DEA head who just resigned this week. And the reason that she was forced out, I'm told, there were a couple of reasons, I think, but one of them was that she really was not a supporter of the position that Obama had of holding back the DOJ and letting the states advance. Now, you could be right, by the way. I may have missed that account of our incoming Attorney General, but it would be hard for me to imagine that Obama would appoint someone and give them enough leeway that they could reverse his policy. He's simply invested too much in this.
Well, all right. There was a black female. Lerner is her name?
No, it's God, I'm sorry, you caught me off guard there. Her nomination's been pending for about 9 months, so I'm afraid around here we've given up on it. Now the truth is, because they finally reached an agreement on the bill that was holding it up, I think by maybe tomorrow, as early as tomorrow, they think she may be approved. And you may be right, by the way.
Yeah,
she may be an opponent to medical use. But keep in mind that, again, the progress that's being made is overwhelmingly at the state level. It's not in Congress. We're making progress in Congress, but you can't measure it by new laws. You can only measure it by the introduction of new proposals, and that is impressive. So I'm not particularly worried about who's going to be the Attorney General for the remaining 2 years of the Obama administration. He's set his course, and I don't think that's going to change.
Well, that's true, because to me, how can you at this point come out on the middle of any day and stand at the top of the steps and say the sun does not shine at high noon? Because that's basically what you're saying when you're saying that there's no medical value to this, there's no industrial, blah, blah. So
in fact, President Obama, just in an interview in the last week or two, talked about the fact that he thought we really did need to do something about medical marijuana. So even he is now beginning to speak in favor of that. I think, by the way, what people also need to understand, sometimes when people call the normal office, they believe that if we simply put marijuana on a lower schedule, or maybe even just took it off the schedule altogether, that somehow then it would be legal under federal law. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The scheduling has to do with whether a doctor can write a prescription for it, and how closely a pharmacy has to protect and control the distribution of that particular drug. But marijuana is illegal under federal law under different provisions. I think it's 18 U.S. or 21 U.S.C. 888, I believe it is, abstract. But there are provisions under federal law separate from the scheduling that make it a crime to possess, to grow, or to sell marijuana. So ultimately, we certainly do need to reschedule marijuana so it's more readily available for research and for medical patients, but we also need to repeal federal prohibition.
Well, yeah, because it's almost as if we're creating laws on this plan on three different levels, one for medicinal value, one for social, i.e. recreational value, and then one for the industrial aspect of this plant.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think the goal eventually should be simply to legalize marijuana in all of its forms, regardless of whether you use it for medical use, for personal recreational use, or for industrial use. There would always be a need for a separate small category for minors who need it for medical use, because obviously you are going to have some age controls dealing with general legalization. So, for example, the kids that we read so much about that suffer from Dravet syndrome and things like that, we still want to make sure we take care of them. So there will always be a need for some separate medical marijuana program. But overall, I think it's time we started cutting the pot docs out of this formula. If marijuana is legal for everyone 21 and over, then that means it's also legal for patients, and you don't need to pay a pot doc. You can just go buy it. So I'd love to see us get to the point, and I think we will be within 3 or 4 years, where we have the political support to simply go directly from decriminalization to full legalization without the interim step of medical use.
Well, and now on the same level as we're speaking, there's going to have to be, from everybody's point of view, from consumer to those who are manufacturing, some sort of standards. So now, right now, we do have what I think are inept and insane, and just where they want to put cameras on every plant and have a little serial number and all that nonsense there, like Colorado. Soon you're going to have acres and acres, and how are you going to do that, right? Okay, so. Well, but you do, like we were talking earlier, you want to be able to go and get a bottle of oil or a couple of brownies because you've got glaucoma or whatever, and you want the dosage right. So how standards and quality now on all levels. I've addressed it. You take it.
Well, I think that what NORML has been about all along has been representing the consumer in the legalization movement. Unfortunately, as long as marijuana remained a contraband substance and it remained a crime to possess it or sell it or use it, it was kind of silly to argue the obvious, that we ought to know the marijuana is free of moles and pesticides. We ought to know the strength of the THC and the CBD and probably the principal terpenes as well. And the only way you do that is by requiring the marijuana to be tested in a state-certified laboratory. Now, much of that is being done. The recreational market in Colorado, you're required to have it tested. But strangely, because the medical system was set up a few years prior to that, the medical marijuana in Colorado is not required to be tested by a laboratory. So I think, by the way, they're about to probably fix that. There's a proposal to do it now. But again, I think the kinds of things that we need to deal with going forward have to do with making sure that we know what is in the marijuana, we know the strength of the marijuana, and we can rely on the representation. For example, right now, you can go to the Internet and you will find all kinds of people claiming they are selling high CBD, low THC marijuana or marijuana oil. Well, and they claim it's legal. The reality is, under federal law, CBD remains illegal in any form. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It is simply illegal, as is THC and as is marijuana under federal law. So, number one, they're misrepresenting that. But when some laboratory recently did a test and they ordered samples of some of this, they found out that much of it had either no CBD or very low CBD, yet they were selling it as if it were going to be what these young children who suffer so many seizures needed to deal with their medical condition. So there are a lot of scam artists out there. And even though on one level I think most of us wish we could just have a free market, kind of the tomato model where you can grow as much marijuana as you want and give it away or sell it or do what you want with it. No age controls or anything else. The reality is that's not realistic. You've got to have some controls to make sure the consumer is protected from moles and pesticides and adulterants that can very easily be added to marijuana. So we don't really want a totally free market. We want a regulated market that protects the interests of the consumer.
Well, and then here's another aspect there's two aspects that I think are really annoying still in this field, is that if I'm having a medical problem, I'm able to write the care of that medical problem off of my taxes, and my medicine's not taxed, et cetera, et cetera. With medical marijuana, medical cannabis, there is a tax on the medical cannabis. There's a tax in all that aspect. And the other thing I don't like about this is if I'm a diabetic, I don't need to tell any employer, future or current or past, that I'm a diabetic. You know, if I have cancer, I don't need to tell my employer that. But if I'm using medical marijuana, medical cannabis, then I have got to tell my employer that. Why? On both those levels that I just mentioned.
Well, I think what we're experiencing, Casper, is a result of 75 plus years of prohibition. When you transition out of such a long period of prohibition into some form of legalization, there are always going to be problems to still be resolved. I mean, for a few years, we're still going to be dealing with this. So let me identify the three areas where I think we're currently falling short, even in the states like Colorado and Washington and Oregon and Alaska, where they fully legalized marijuana. Most importantly, probably to the largest number of people, is that even if you're in a state where marijuana is fully legal for those 21 and over, and you smoke marijuana on the weekend, when you go into work on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever, if they do a drug test and you test positive, they are legally allowed to fire you, as if you are coming to work in an impaired condition without having to demonstrate any impairment whatsoever, simply the presence of THC in your system. Now, that's incredibly unfair. There are large numbers of people who are losing their jobs and their ability to support their families because they are using marijuana legally under state law, and they presume that means as long as they're responsible and they don't smoke it before they go to work, that they're okay. Well, right now they're not. Secondly, child custody. I receive 2-3 calls every week that are terribly sad from parents who are having to fight to retain the custody of their children. And frequently it results simply from a nosy neighbor who smells marijuana, knows the family has a couple of minor kids, so they call the Child Protective Service. Well, when the Child Protective Service, and it doesn't much matter which state you're in, they all seem to operate pretty much the same, they presume that if you're a marijuana smoker, you are an unfit parent. And the obligation is on you to prove them wrong. For example, the first thing they'll do, they'll assume that you probably live in squalor since you smoke marijuana, so they come out and do a home inspection, to make sure that the house is clean and tidy and appropriate for young children. Then they make you take a parenting course, which you have to pay for, and they're not much more sophisticated than the drug education courses. They make you take a drug education course, and they're no better than they were in the 1950s. Now, at the end of that, assuming you're willing to swear that you will never smoke in front of the minor children, only once they're in bed asleep at night or visiting their grandparents on the weekend, then in almost every case, the parents do regain custody of the kids. But what a horrible experience to go through simply because you smoke marijuana. If you're a responsible smoker, that doesn't suggest you're not a loving and dutiful parent. Think about the number of people that sit at home and drink 2 six-packs of beer and throw the beer cans against the wall. They've got kids. Did anybody ever remove their children because they were beer drinkers? No, of course not. And neither should they be involved with marijuana smokers in that regard. And then finally, DUID. And again, all three of these really come back to the question of we need to develop a test for impairment, not a test simply to detect THC. What many states have today are laws that legally presume that you are driving under the influence of drugs, DUID they often call it, if you have any THC in your system. Well, you're only impacted for maybe an hour and a half after you smoke. Most of the research indicates that you probably should not drive for about an hour to an hour and a half after you smoke the joint. But after that, there's no measurable impairment at all. Yet that THC will stay in your system for days, and if you're a long-time smoker, sometimes for weeks. So, you could smoke today, and not smoke again for 30 days and get pulled over on a minor traffic offense. And if they give you a breathalyzer and don't see any alcohol and they think something's wrong, they're going to check you for THC. And if you got any in your system, in about half the states, you're going to be convicted of DUID, no defense. So obviously, we've still got a lot of work to do. As I say, NORML is a consumer lobby, so those are the kinds of issues that we are terribly concerned about. The reason that we couldn't fix them initially is this. I talked earlier a little about the fact that roughly 14% of the public smoke and 86% of the public do not. There was a fascinating poll survey released just a month or so ago showing that 53% of the country nationwide supports full legalization, pretty similar to what Gallup has found and Pew has found. But this survey went further and asked those same people who favor ending prohibition and fully legalizing marijuana, not just for medical use. They asked them what they thought about recreational smokers, and 64%, almost 2 out of 3, had a negative impression of recreational marijuana smokers. In other words, they still buy into those stereotypes that somehow if you're a marijuana smoker, you're some stoner who sits home on the sofa all day, you don't fulfill your potential in life or in your work or in your family or marriage. Those are terribly damaging stereotypes. We must get beyond them before we can fix these other issues. And I think the only way we get beyond them is more and more Americans need to come out of the closet and let their friends and neighbors and colleagues at work know that, yes, they're a responsible marijuana smoker. But other than that, they're just an average American who works hard and contributes in a positive way to their community. We have to overcome these negative stereotypes.
And we also pay our bills, which we're going to do right now, and then come back in exactly 2 minutes and 20 seconds here on Time for Hemp.
Serious Seeds is your source for quality cannabis and sativa seeds. Serious Seeds are the creators of legendary strains like AK-47, Bubblegum, Chronic, Cali Mist, and White Russian. The AK-47 is probably the most awarded strain on the planet. The high THC content of AK-47 makes it the perfect medical strain for patients seeking quick pain relief. Cali Mist is an almost pure sativa. Female medical cannabis patients have reported that this strain helps relieve menstrual cramps. Serious Seeds just acquired another Dutch high-quality seed bank, Magus Genetics. From now on, Serious Seeds can offer you even more award-winning strains. The fine folks at Serious Seeds strive to breed the best cannabis genetics that they can find, so patients can rely on the effectiveness of their medicine. Go to SeriousSeeds.com to grow your medicine. That site again is SeriousSeeds.com.
Well, the Western had a bowl, good green reefer, big fat Jones beef, much sweeter. Mighty don't hide it. Mighty don't hide it. Well, mighty don't hide it. Mighty don't hide it. Well, mighty don't hide it. Fire up right now.
Well, you are listening to Time for Hemp, so I hope you are firing up right now. Don't forget, anytime you hear the word joint on the big broadcast, please fire up your joint, pass it around with your friends, take a toke. On the big joint broadcast, we like to make it a point to use the joint word as often as we can. Now, we are having a joint conversation with my joint friend here, Keith Stroup, who's worked diligently. Keith, I can tell you, you're talking about disruption of life. There's two things I want to get into. We've got about 14 minutes here. One is, Mr. Stroup, I'm sorry, can you pull your car over here? Oh, gosh, look, there's a marijuana roach in your car. Oh, look, $40,000 in the trunk of your car. Oh, well, we're going to keep your money. We're going to keep your nice car. You might want to get a bus ride home, though. Good luck. And then the other, no, really, call a good lawyer. And then if you do go to jail, I can certainly tell you, we want to touch upon, Keith, I would really be annoyed sitting in a Colorado jail cell for using marijuana or selling marijuana or growing marijuana only, and then everybody around me is making a buttload of money off of marijuana, and I'm still in jail. So we got these clowns taking money out of our pockets, and we're still being forced to look at the market around us and cry. What's up?
Well, I think both of those issues are terribly important. If you'll give me the privilege, let me take 1 second to tell you. I just saw on my computer here that the Senate an hour ago just confirmed Loretta Leitch as the new Attorney General. I was having trouble remembering her name earlier. Now that she's confirmed, I guess I better spend a little bit of time on Google and find out precisely what her views are on marijuana policy. As I say, I don't think it's terribly important because the last 2 years of the Obama administration, it's clear he set his own course, and he wouldn't have appointed an Attorney General and allow her to change that. Nonetheless, I don't know specifically how she feels about it personally. Now, to the issues you identified, civil asset forfeiture has always been one of the dark secrets of the criminal justice system. Most people believe that forfeiture is something that happens if you use something in the commission of a crime or if you use the proceeds from a crime to buy something. That's traditional criminal forfeiture, and most of us wouldn't argue with that. If somebody is using the car to smuggle something, back and forth day after day, and they finally catch him, and he's got a trunk full of stuff, then I'm not shocked that once they convict him, they can seize his car. But civil asset forfeiture is something that most people are not aware of. And under civil forfeiture, you don't even have to bring criminal charges. In other words, the police can seize your vehicle, like you pointed out, if they pull you over on a traffic offense and see some marijuana in the glove compartment or something, and if they want to, they can seize your automobile and never bring criminal charges against you. It is theoretically a legal action against the property, not against the individual, and therefore you essentially have no defense at all. Now, recently, Attorney General Holder has announced that they are scaling back on their forfeiture, and in general, they are not going to use forfeiture unless they are also bringing criminal charges. Now, again, I know that it takes a long time sometimes for these pronouncements from on high to be fully implemented all across the country by all the various U.S. attorneys. So I'm not foolish enough to think that we're not going to see any more civil forfeitures. But I did think it was a significant change in tone and a recognition that there's something just basically terribly unfair about stealing someone's property and never charging them with a crime. And the reason the police used that so often was because there are a couple of different programs under which the police get to keep the large majority of the proceeds. If they take that car, they either sell it and keep the money, or they add the car to their collection of cars that they use for undercover work. But either way, you can see the conflict of interest. The law enforcement agency that is supposed to be exercising some discretion as to whether there's a basis to forfeit your property, they have a preset bias in favor of taking all the property they can get. And for the longest time, the federal government offered them a program where, in case the state law did not allow the local police to keep the proceeds, because a few states don't, you could rather hand it over to the feds, and the feds would then give 90% of the proceeds back to the police force at the state level. So it's a nasty, ugly business, and it needs to come to an end. Now, real quickly, clemency. What do we do about the people that are locked up for offenses which are no longer illegal? Now, in some ways, I can't think of anything more offensive than what you proposed, that you're sitting in a jail cell because you were a nonviolent marijuana smuggler or dealer or grower or whatever. And now you see 4 states where people get licensed by the state to do the same thing you were doing, and you got sent to prison. Well, surely once it's now been legalized, those people need to be let out. But there is nothing in any of the first few legalization laws that do that or that does that automatically. We must go back and individually apply for clemency. And clemency is not easy to get. I just recently, President Obama did issue some clemency to, I don't know, a handful, 20 people or something like that. And a few of them were marijuana offenders. So, I'm glad to see that process start. But, man, we've got a long way to go. There are tens of thousands of people sitting in jails all across this country, mostly in state prisons, for things which have now been legalized in 4 states. Michael Kennedy, the chairman of the board of High Times magazine, recently filed a petition with the Department of Justice on behalf of, I believe it was 8 nonviolent marijuana offenders, marijuana defendants, prisoners, who are currently serving life sentences for a nonviolent marijuana offense. Now, that is truly nonsense. It's nonsense that we even treat people like criminals, but the idea that you would have people serving life sentences for a nonviolent offense, terrible. So at least there are some good people like Michael Kennedy who are taking the time to file those clemency petitions. Now, there's been no action on them yet, and there may not be, but at least we've got to make the effort.
Well, and it now continues to boggle my mind as well how federal governments and states governments like Indiana continue to wage this war in the face of so much deficit in their states and in their federal coffers, realizing that just a quick turnaround would bring the coffers back into a positive inflow.
Well, I do think one of the arguments that's going to be most persuasive to states that are neighboring Colorado and Washington and Oregon in particular, those states have got to be looking at their own residents driving across the state line to legally buy marijuana and pay taxes to the other state. Colorado, I believe, the first year collected a total, I believe it was $76 million, and that'll only continue to go up because they're opening more and more dispensaries every year. And the same thing will be true in the other legalization states. There's real money to be raised by the states, and most of the states, when they're doing it, it doesn't go into the general fund. It's allocated in Colorado, for example. I think the first $25 million has to go to education for teachers and new schools and things like that. So obviously, if you're a state like Kansas and you're sitting next to Colorado, at some point, I think it's got to dawn on them that instead of continuing to spend so much money chasing and arresting and prosecuting marijuana smokers, why don't we focus that law enforcement resources on serious crime and meanwhile regulate and tax marijuana so that some of that $100 million a year or so stays in Kansas instead of going over to neighboring Colorado. Gambling at one time, I'm old enough to remember when it was only legal in Las Vegas, and then after that, Las Vegas and Atlantic City. Now, the rest of the states knew that gambling was a lucrative business and the state could make a lot of money, but for a long time they considered it sort of immoral. It was sinful or whatever. But over time, they got over that when they saw how much money these states were making. Today, I think every state in the country has some form of legal gambling. In Missouri, I always laugh when I remember that you can't have a casino on land, but it's fine to have one on a riverboat in the middle of the Mississippi River. I don't know what that distinction's about. But I think the same process is what we're going to see with marijuana legalization. Some states, more conservative states, and states that have a strong religious constituency, may initially think that it's immoral or it's just sinful or something, and so we shouldn't raise money off of it. But over the longer term, you can be certain they too will realize they need the revenue, they have programs that are underfunded, and it's a simple act to switch from prohibition to regulation and taxation.
All right, well, we're down to the last couple of minutes now. Keith, I know there's people out there reading the headlines, seeing Dr. Gahuchi on CNN talk about how we got to end this war on drugs and we're making advances. They're probably all thinking the war is over. Not much I need to do now. All I can do is just relax and smoke my joint and go about my business. Blah, right? It's over with, huh? Go home?
Well, I do think the tendency is to read the headlines and think, boy, we're winning. Well, they're right about that. We are winning. I mean, as I say, for the first time about 3 years ago, the national polls started showing that more than half of the country nationwide now favor full legalization, and they're opposed to prohibition. But realistically, we've got 50 states, so we've legalized in 4, and we've got 46 to go. So I'm sure the average listener out there on your radio program wishes they lived in California or wish they lived in a state that had laws like the Colorado law. So they could go and buy their marijuana. So they didn't have to deal with the black market. And so they knew what they were buying and what was in it. But we got a long way to go before we're going to get there. I think we'll probably add 4 or 5 additional states in 2016 to the list of legalization. But again, you know, until we get all 50 states legalized, the job is not done. So, again, I think we're past the tipping point. I think the vast majority, not the vast majority, but the majority of the American public now understand that prohibition is a failed public policy, and they prefer regulation and legalization. But state legislatures are notoriously conservative, and I can tell you it's going to be a number of years before states like Mississippi and Alabama and Oklahoma and some of those in South Carolina, they're not going to be legalizing marijuana anytime soon. So we've still got a lot of work ahead of us.
And there is a big green rush. It seems like there are a good number of people who are exiting the states that have maintained prohibition and are moving into states where this is becoming a thriving business and an opportunity for their kids and themselves and their parents to get medication. Isn't that right?
I just returned from 6 days out in Denver. I was out for the High Times Cannabis Cup and for 420. And it is truly inspirational to spend some time in a city where they have created tens of thousands of new jobs. Congressman Jared Polis from Boulder likes to talk about the fact of the number of young, rich entrepreneurs who've been lured to Colorado to get involved in this new industry and create new jobs. It's a very exciting time. And for the states that don't make the move, that sort of lag behind, I can tell you, those folks with the money and those folks with the interest in creating the jobs are not going to hold back. They're going to move to the states where they can do that. But yes, there's a hell of a green rush underway right now, and it's very exciting to see. And not just because a lot of people can make money, but because it adds enormously to our political power.
Well, with that said, I want those people who are listening to know that if they want to see this movement progress farther, a good thing to do. I know you're all sitting there with this ton of cash and no bank to put it in. You can make a money order out and send it to Washington, D.C., and make it out to National Normal and make a donation. You're like our lobbyist, aren't you, Keith?
We are indeed. We are a lobby for responsible marijuana smokers, both on the state and federal level, and we appreciate anyone's support. If they're interested in supporting NORML, just go to our website, normal.org, NORML.org.
Any big events you want to put a spotlight on before we wrap it up?
No, other than I just think it's a wonderful time to be alive if you're a marijuana smoker. You realize that it's been 100 years since we had an entire new industry created, and that was when we ended alcohol prohibition. There aren't many times in one's life when you get to witness such a change in social policy, and that's what we're seeing right now. So again, if you're a marijuana smoker, sit back and enjoy it. It's a wonderful time to be alive.
It certainly is, and it's a great thing to share with all your friends. And with that said, remember, the next time you hear me, you'll know that it's time for hemp.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look and spend some time for hemp. Don't cut trees for paper, 'cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yes, it's time for hemp. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rest. Well, time for hemp! Yeah!
Education and information. See what all the buzz is all about. It's time for hemp. It's time for hemp.